Carrying on in the Judges, chapter 7, verse 7 through 8:28 today. Now the judges are really just imperfect people who are used by God to deliver his people from oppression. We're focusing our attention both in the last 2 weeks and this week on the life of Gideon. So let's review. So far, the Midianites had God's people running for their lives. They were living in caves and mountain clefts out of fear. Their livestock were plundered, and we find Gideon in the winepress threshing wheat in hiding from the Midianites. The angel of the Lord appears to him and says, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Gideon was anything but that in that moment, and he argues with the Lord about it. But God has a way of winning these kind of arguments. Gideon worships God and strikes down the shrines of the false gods on his dad's property. Last week, we find Gideon testing God and asking for signs to say, if this is really you, if you really want me to lead this battle against the Midianites, then help me out. And he had the famous tests of the fleece and the dew, and God did exactly as Gideon asked. And then God tests Gideon. As Gideon gathers the army, he finds that they're outnumbered 4-1. And God says, "You still have too many men." And God told Gideon to send home everyone who was afraid. 2/3 leave, and now they're outnumbered 12-1. And God says, "You still have way too many." So the number gets narrowed down to just 300 men. Now they're at about 400-1. God says, "That's about just right. Now you're going to know, and everyone will know that you did not do this of your own strength." Can you think of a battle that you're facing right now, or a situation in your life that feels overwhelming? Maybe it's more than 400-1 odds against you. What is it that you're struggling with today? Just talk for a moment if you're with some people, or stop and think about it, and maybe even pray about it. Picking back up in chapter 7, verse 8, we find that the Israelites have 300 men, and they took over the provisions and the trumpets of all the others who left. Now the camp of Midian lay below them in the valley. And during the night, the Lord said to Gideon, "Get up, go down against the camp, because I'm going to give it into your hands." And God knew Gideon is still afraid. In fact, he would be kind of dumb not to be afraid. And he says, "If you're afraid to attack, Gideon, go down to the camp with your servant and listen to what the people are saying, and afterwards you're going to be encouraged." So he and his servant go down to the camp, and they listen in around the tents of some of the Midianites. And they're saying, "I had a dream." One man said to the other, "A round loaf of barley bread came tumbling down into the camp, struck the tent with such force that the tent overturned and collapsed." And his Midianite friend responded, "Well, this can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, the Israelite. God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands." And when Gideon heard the dream and the interpretation, he worshipped God. That was a smart response. He returned to the camp of Israel and called, "Get up! The Lord has given the Midianites into our hands." And dividing the 300 men into 3 companies, he put every man armed with a trumpet, an empty jar, and a torch. Inside the empty jar, "Watch me, follow my lead. When I get to the edge of the camp, Gideon said, do exactly as I do. And when I and all who are with me blow our trumpets, then from all around the camp of the Midianites in the valley, you blow yours and shout, for the Lord and for Gideon. And Gideon and the 100 men with him reached the edge of the camp, beginning in the middle of the watch, so that's kind of around midnight, and when no armies fight at midnight. So just after they had changed the guard, they blew their trumpets, broke their jars, and there was such a loud noise and bright lights, and the 3 companies all blew their trumpets and smashed their jars, grasping the torches in their left hands, holding the right hand with the trumpet. They started blowing and shouted, a sword for the Lord and for Gideon. And while each man held his position around the camp, all the Midianites were crying out as they fled. They all ran away. And the 300 men trumpets were shouting. The Lord caused the men throughout the camp to turn their swords on each other, and the army fled away. I love that story. It's remarkable. And if I were, well, in fact, most of the times when I tell the story of Gideon, I kind of end it there. That's pretty awesome. The Midianites all just killed each other or ran away. Gideon and his army of 300 wiped out the Midianites of 125 or 135,000 people, I guess it was, something like that. Awesome. God is so good. So maybe, can you recall a battle in your life that God clearly won for you? That you maybe were up against something way too difficult for you and God won the victory. Well, I kind of wish the story of Gideon just ended there, because what we're going to read about today, starting in chapter 7, verse 23 and on through chapter 8, verse 28, is sort of Gideon's demise, because he's in the moment of this remarkable victory and he pursues those who are running away. In chapter 7, verse 23, he sends messengers throughout the hill country of Ephraim, which was his fellow people, and said, come down against the Midianites, seize the waters of the Jordan ahead of them. And all the men of Ephraim were called out, took the waters of the Jordan, and they captured 2 of the Midianite leaders, Oreb and Zeb, and killed those leaders at the winepress of Zeb. And then they pursued the Midianites and brought the heads of Oreb and Zeb to Gideon, which was quite a statement of, honor to Gideon. Here's your the leaders of the Midianite army, and we're bringing you their heads. Now then, the Ephraimites challenged Gideon a little bit in chapter 8, verse 1, and they said, why'd you treat us like this? You didn't call us to join you in your fight against Midian. And they criticized him sharply. And then Gideon kind of showed his lack of self-esteem or his insecurity about himself a little bit, and he goes, well, what was I able to do to compare to you? You're the ones that got Oreb and Zeb. And at this they kind of went, oh yeah, okay, well, and their resentment against him subsided. It was a bit of a diplomatic move, but it also showed his lack of real confidence too. And it's this insecurity that's going to actually be a big stumbling block for Gideon. And we'll see that as we go forward. Gideon and his 300 men, exhausted, yet keeping up in the pursuit, they cross the Jordan. They come to the men of Succoth. And he says, give my troops some bread. We're hungry and worn out, and we're still pursuing a couple of the Midianite leaders, the kings of Midian, Zebah and Zalmunna. But the officials of Succoth said, Do you already have their heads in possession? Why should we give you bread? And Gideon said, well, just for that, I'm not only going to get their heads, I'm going to come back and I'm going to exact some revenge on you guys. I'm going to tear your flesh with desert thorns and briars. And then he goes on to the next town, Peniel, and he makes the same request of them. Give my men some bread. And they said the same thing. No, why should we? And he says, again, more threats to the people of Peniel. When I return in triumph, I'm going to tear down your tower. So he keeps pursuing Zebah and Zalmunna with a force of about 15,000 men. They still have 15,000. 120 swordsmen had followed, and Gideon went up and fell upon the unsuspecting army. And 2 of the kings of Midian fled, but he pursued them still and captured them and routed the entire army. Amazing. Gideon, son of Joash, then returned from the battle. By the pass of Heres, he caught a young man and questioned him, and the young man wrote down for him the names of 77 official officers of Succoth, the elders of the town. And Gideon came back and said to the men of Succoth, here are Zebah and Zalmunna, about whom you taunted me by saying, do you already have them? And he took the elders of the town and taught the men of Succoth a lesson by punishing them with desert thorns and briars, and pulled down the tower of Peniel and killed the men of the town. And then he turns to the Midianite kings, Zebah and Zalmunna. What kind of men did you kill at Tabor? And they answered, men like you, each one with the bearing of a prince. A little bit of flattery, I imagine, to see if they could get Gideon to, befriend them a little. Gideon replied, well, those were my brothers, the sons of my own mother. And as surely as the Lord lives, if you had spared their lives, I wouldn't kill you. Turning to his oldest son, Jether, he told him to kill the kings, which was quite a humiliation to be killed by a boy. Jether did not draw his sword because he was a boy and he was afraid, and so the king said to Gideon, you do it yourself. So Gideon did step forward, killed them, and took the ornaments off the camels' necks. We see here a vengeful Gideon. We see here a Gideon who's taking things further than maybe he ought to. But then we read the next story, and this is where we really see something sad happening in Gideon's life. The Israelites said to Gideon, rule over us, you and your son and grandson, because you saved us out of the hand of Midian. But Gideon told them, now listen to his words, I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you. It sounds really good, right? And let's just think about the governmental system of the Israelites for a moment. It's a group of tribes who had settled in the land of promise, or they were working on settling and being there. Through the book of Joshua, we see how they had conquered and settled in the land of promise. The 12 tribes lived somewhat peacefully. We know that they had not killed all the Canaanites, so the Canaanites would rise up and oppress them, and then God would raise up a judge who would deliver them. They'd have this battle, they'd subdue the Canaanites, and they'd live at peace for a while. And all of this was to happen under the worship of the one true God, a true theocracy where God alone is the king of all. He rules over all. So Gideon is right when he says, the Lord will rule over you. But then he adds this next piece, and he says, I do have one request. In verse 24 in chapter 8, I want each of you to give me an earring from your share of the plunder. You see, the Midianites used to wear a lot of gold jewelry and gold earrings. And so the people who had plundered the Midianite army, they took all the gold off the people who had died, and they answered, "Oh, sure, we'll be glad to give them." So they all gave one earring. Well, it said they spread out a garment, each man threw a ring in from their plunder, and the weight of the gold rings came to 1,700 shekels. That's a lot of gold. And that's not counting the ornaments and the pendants and the purple garments worn by the kings or the Midianites, or the chains that were on their camels' necks, because they used to be very bejeweled and ornamental. Gideon took all this gold and made it into an ephod. Now, an ephod is a piece of the priestly garments in the worship of God, where it was made of metal, and it had 12 stones in it that was to represent one of each of the tribes of Israel. And the priest would wear this, and it would be a representation of the person who is to go between God and the people. Gideon wasn't a priest. He was just a very new warrior even, and won this great battle because God was behind it, and God was to be worshipped. And now all of a sudden, Gideon is making this ornamental thing, which a gold ephod would have been too heavy to actually be of any actual use in the worship of God. And so it just became a thing, it says, that Israel prostituted themselves against God by worshiping this gold ephod instead of worshiping the one true God. And the word then says it became a snare to Gideon and to his family. Pretty sad ending to a mighty battle, and a man who was transformed from somebody so insecure and fearful into this great and mighty warrior. I used to really think highly of Gideon. I liked the transformation story, and I identified with Gideon in his pretty low opinion of himself. I remember asking myself at times, well, who am I? I don't really matter. What can I do? And I felt overlooked and inadequate, and sometimes had a victim mentality, or maybe felt hopeless in the face of overwhelming obstacles in my life. God redefined Gideon's identity and helped him to realize, Gideon, you're not a victim, and you are a mighty man of valor. And he transformed him into this person who had this great and remarkable victory. God had great patience with Gideon to develop his courage, and even in the last moment before the battle, reassured him even once again, go down to the camp and listen to what they're saying. You're going to be encouraged. You can do this thing. But there were these things that happened in Gideon's heart that betrayed, even though he said the right things, it betrayed what was still in his heart. He exacted revenge on his own countrymen with humiliation, or by humiliating them, and tried to humiliate the kings of his enemy kings, by having his son kill him. He took ornaments from the camels' necks, and he took gold, made it into an ephod, which was really maybe a treasonous act against God's authority, by trying to seize that piece that represented the authority of God's representative. It's a danger when we feel insecure and God gives us strength and power, that we begin to think that maybe I am something after all. And I fear for this at times. In my my life too. If God gave me strength and courage to win a mighty battle, how would I really respond? How would I deal with success? Luke 4, verses 5 through 8, we see the temptation of Jesus. In this second temptation, the greed of recognition is offered to Jesus. I just want to look at this passage for just a moment. Satan takes him up, it says, to a high place and showed him in an instant all the kingdoms of the world. And he said, I'll give you all their authority and splendor, for it's been given to me. At the fall, all the authority was given to Satan. And Satan said, I can give it to whoever I want to, so if you worship me, all this could be yours. And Jesus answered, it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only. How significant is it that Jesus did not succumb to that temptation? And we would not possibly know freedom from bondage to sin today had Jesus not won that battle. In Philippians 2, verses 5 to 10, we read about the kenosis passage, or it's the Greek word that means emptying, that Jesus did not think that it was it says in verse 6, Philippians 2, who being in very nature God, Jesus was God, he did not consider it equality with God something to be grasped. Jesus the man needed to go through another battle, and he knew it. The cross was yet before him when Satan was tempting him. And he could have thwarted that whole process and done whatever Satan asked him to do, and it, of course he would not have had all authority over Satan at that point. That was a lie. But Jesus knew, worship God only. He made himself nothing, took the very nature of a servant, made in human likeness, found in appearance as a man, humbled himself, became obedient to death, even death on a cross, and therefore God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is the Lord, to the glory of God the Father. It's so important that all honor and all glory goes to Jesus in the middle of every success of life. We can only win our battles when God is with us, and in all of it we must remain true to worship God and God alone, and not take any of the glory for ourselves as Gideon had. In reflection today on today's lesson, I just want to ask, we have a lot of discussion today in parenting and in understanding who we are in our own identity formation, about building self-esteem and learning how to love ourselves and be strong and be courageous. And my question would be, at what point does building up self-esteem or losing our victim mentality, if you will, become a snare for greed for recognition or deceitful pride? And my next question is, how could we keep an attitude of humility and give the rightful worship to God in our successes? As we take some time and think about that, maybe pray about it together in your groups, make sure that you honor the Lord in all that is said and done, the struggles as well as the victories this week. God bless.